Why do you think that we should check our language practices these days?
Yes. So, I feel like if we could be a fly on the wall in any of our spaces, whether we serve in urban communities, rural communities, suburban, like anywhere we are, any grade level, any content we teach, we could overhear a whole lot of language being spoken by the adults in the school system, teachers, leaders, administrators, like every role. And we could capture a whole lot of really great things, but we could also capture a lot of really problematic statements. And many of these statements, I think, have gone unchecked for years. And it has, again, just kind of perpetuated systems that oppress our students. And sometimes we are saying things out of like a gut reaction, but sometimes it really can illuminate some problematic biases that we have. And again, we all have them. Like, we're human beings, we have them. But we have to kind of do that digging and unpacking of like, oh, wait, like this is a problem.
Sometimes it's school culture, right? It's language norms.
Yes.
So it's things that people just say all the time. This is what we say at our school.
Yes. And it almost is as like, it becomes like a bingo board of like, buzzwords in education. Yeah. That could be a bingo game, like during a staff meeting. But yeah, some of these phrases again, and we could just kind of hand them down and we regurgitate them. And then when new teachers, new leaders come into our systems, like they start taking on those language choices too. And it's like, we want to kind of pause it and disrupt it a little bit.
Just a little bit, just disrupt just a little bit.
Just a little bit, just like throw it all in a blender and like change it completely.
Just a little bit. Okay. So, all right. Well, can you give me some examples? What are some things that we are saying?
Yes. So, especially again, like my lens is always that multilingual education lens. And so I've served in a like bilingual settings and dual language settings specifically. As students are navigating 2 or more languages simultaneously, like their brains are doing a million beautiful things. But sometimes when we sit down and we talk about student data, we'll say things like, oh, this student is low in both languages. Whew. And that statement, anytime we say anything like period, like a student is low, period, like that's really problematic, right? Like numbers can be high and low, percentages can be high and low, but children cannot be. And so, we really want to shift that language choice and really like show what's actually happening. Like, no, a student is not low in both languages. They're developing in 2 languages simultaneously. Like, let's call that out and call attention to what the student is doing and like honor that. It's a great thing. And we should highlight that. And so we got to kind of flip that language a little bit.
Let me ask you this question, because I could see somebody arguing, oh, this is just a matter of semantics. What type of process, or you kind of mentioned bias earlier, what type of process does this change when we change our language?
Language often speaks life to our beliefs and our mindsets. And again, sometimes people will say things like, it's just words, but words have power and like words have impact. And it kind of goes back to those conversations of like impact versus intent, right? Like, well, I didn't mean it like that. Okay, but it can be taken right, by a variety of audiences, by a variety of folks around the table here, in a lot of different ways. So we have to like honor the way that our words can, impact, and it really impacts the way that we serve our students. If we're always talking about them when they're not in the room and we're saying things like they're low or they're not motivated, that really affects the way when we come back into our spaces and we look at a student, we're saying, oh, this student is low. And so I'm going to lower the bar, lower expectations. Or again, I'm just going to keep regurgitating the same conversation of like, oh, that student's not motivated. And it's, again, a source of frustration rather than how am I empowering this child?
It's like, when we say affirmations, right? We say positive things. You stand in the mirror, you say all these positive things. I'm this, I'm that. So if we're saying this about our students in a negative way, imagine what type of process a teacher might take. We're just going to assume unconsciously, right? But when we're saying positive things, like you said, they're developing.
Yeah.
right? As opposed to, oh, they're low. But no, they're striving, they're aspiring, they're doing these things that are, some people say, approaching.
Mhm.
Some
Mhm.
people refer to their students in general as scholars, right?
Yes.
There is no student, no, they're scholars. Everyone here are scholars. And just think about the culture that creates, the school's culture that it creates when that type of language is being utilized every day.
Yes, yes. And I always think about this because again, like when we gather as educators and leaders around a table and we're talking about like a particular student in mind, and the student's not in the room with us, but we're saying all these things, we're throwing all this language out into the air. What if the child was in the room, or what if their family was
Mm.
in the room with us? Would we still say those things? It just kind of, it gives us a moment of pause, like, oh, like, this is it's a good practice to just to have that reflective language, time and space.
Yeah, yeah, I'm definitely. We could keep going on that for a while. But common sense, at the end of the day, like, don't say stuff that, again, someone could fall on the wrong ears and things like that, or someone could tell. It could be someone's cousin, could be someone's mother, like all these things we just don't know.
Yeah.
So let's move on. What is maybe something else that we say that we should change?
So a really common phrase that I have overheard over the years, and it's so frustrating. And every time I hear it again, it kind of takes my breath away. Anytime somebody makes a statement about a family or an entire population of families and says a statement like, "Those families are not
Ooh.
involved," that one makes my blood boil. Um,
People still say that, those people.
Yes, those, yeah. Not even the families, but those families. Like,
Yes.
I am physically going to put distance between myself and that group of families. Um, it kind of just, it stops your heart a little bit. But it's interesting, like when you unpack the term parental involvement, and I always put air quotes because I have issues with the word involvement.
Sure. Me too.
I prefer, instead of parental involvement, I prefer family engagement. Engagement, you think of an engagement ring. An engagement ring, there's a relationship. It goes,
Yeah. It's
it's a
a, it's a
circle.
it's the difference between the parental involvement is doing to, and parental engagement is doing with.
Yes, exactly.
Bottom line.
Exactly. Yes. And it's interesting, like as I talk to educators in different workshops and things, we always, like, I'll say, like, how would you define parent involvement? And many times people will say, like, well, if the parents are on PTA, or if the parents
Mm.
come to the parent teacher conference. And I'm like, wait, but are we really making entire judgments about families based on those two events? Like, oh, that's alarming, because many times those events are based on privilege.
Yeah.
Like, we are assuming a lot when we talk about, like, the PTA, for example. We are assuming that the family has, number one, transportation, for example, transportation
Mhm.
to the school for the meeting. Number one, were they invited to the meeting? Like, truly, were they invited? Because many times it's through email in
Yeah.
English only. And
Hmm.
we're, families who have Wi-Fi, who have a device, who have English literacy skills. And again, then also have the availability. And then we're saying, oh, they're not on the PTA, they're not involved. Or same thing with parent teacher conferences. Oh, well, they didn't come to that, they're not involved. Like, maybe they didn't have childcare, or
Yeah.
maybe, there's a whole lot of reasons. There's a whole lot of reasons. But if we make just that entire blanket, statement about the family or an entire group of family,
Yeah.
then it's just, it illuminates again that problematic bias that maybe has gone unchecked.
Here's my thing with that conversation, and I'm not glorifying the whole saying labeling an entire population or entire group of people, but what I am saying is, maybe we should consider, well, why is that entire group of people not attending these events that we're talking about? Is there something that we could be doing? See,
Yeah.
we often put the blame on the community members, the stakeholders. The school never does anything wrong. And it's
Yes.
like, okay, if you're telling me a whole neighborhood or a whole community is not
Mhm.
showing up to
Yep.
this event, or they're not showing up to anything,
Yep.
Why is that the
Yes.
case?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And what kind of messaging are we communicating to various groups of families? Like what, like again, it puts that responsibility back on us. Like we need to do as a school, we need to do that inner reflection and have that dialogue and make ourselves uncomfortable and say, wow,
Mhm.
we're missing the mark here. Like we're doing something wrong.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't put it on. If you know, it's I always used to tell teachers like, okay, you had the majority of your class, they failed the test. So maybe there's something that we need to think about as far as our teaching approach, because
Exactly.
if it's the majority of our class, that's got to be something that we need to reconsider. So I feel the same way. I feel like sometimes we put blame on our families and not
Yes.
consider, well, what are some things that we could do. I was a victim of this as well. Like when I,
Mm.
as a special ed person, I used to do IEPs, and I plan the meetings right in the middle of the day because it was convenient for me. I was at school, right? I'm at work, so just
Yeah.
come on
Yeah.
over when I'm at work. But when you start doing them in the evenings, when you start doing them early mornings, and try to
Right.
do it in like lunchtime when they can come on breaks, as opposed to when it's, oh, I don't have any meetings between 1 and 3 right now, I'm open. Why don't I schedule it for them this time, as opposed to really thinking about, well, what would work best for this parent who I'm supposed to be serving? What will
Yes.
work best for them in this scenario, as opposed to doing what's best for me?
Yes, absolutely. And we often talk about something like that. We call it the affective filter with our students. Like they have, like all of us have these invisible walls around us. And when we're stressed or nervous or uncomfortable or anxious, the wall goes up and no new learning can pass, right?
Mhm.
But all of us adults, we have it too. The families that we serve, they have it too. And like when we send out like those flyers for, we're having a math night or we're having a
Yeah.
literacy night, and we notice like maybe this group of families is not coming, and again, like you said, we need to unpack why. Let's like really be strategic and mindful of how we're inviting families. I started to get really real with some of my moms over the years, and like I would ask them for feedback, like how am I doing, how's my communicate, and they gave me such good information, such good feedback. And they one family said, and again, I had families from all over the world, one of the moms said to me, you know what, Mrs. Spina, I had no idea even like what to wear to this event. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, I wouldn't have even thought of that. And so then as I started to kind of think like through parent teacher conferences, like here, what to do if you're late, text me at this number because I can't answer my phone because I'm in other meetings. Text me at this number. Here's what I'm going to wear: jeans. I would invite you to dress down. If you need to bring in your other children, please bring them in. I'll have water for you. And if I had another adult like joining the meeting, like an interventionist or a gifted enrichment teacher or whoever, I would also notify them ahead of time so they don't come in like, like, wait a minute, there's like this team of teachers. I thought it was just going to be you and I. So like I had to get really real about lowering the affective filter for the families. Because I was like, I am creating some uncomfortable situations, and I really don't want to do that. I want my families, when they walk into the building, I want them to be like, this is my place. My
Mm.
child is loved here. My family is affirmed here. We are, we're welcome. We're safe here. Like I want that for all of our families.
That's good. That's good. And I'm glad. And I'm happy to hear you say that. So, are there anything? Are there other things that we are saying that you would like for, that we really need to consider?
So this one gets said a lot when we're talking about students who are like approaching that middle school age or high school age. We say things that like, this student is just not motivated,
Hmm.
like period, as like a character trait. They're just not motivated, period. And instead, like, let's be really specific about what we have found isn't working to inspire this child. So again, like for me as an adult, I'm not motivated by stickers or incentive charts or behavior charts that are very ableist. I'm not
Public
I'm not
shaming. Public shaming. I
I'm
always
not
say
a
it's public
fan.
shaming.
Uh, so, and when we have like, we get around the table, and again, we're having student data meetings and we're talking about kids, particular students in mind, and we say like, oh, they're not motivated. Let's pause that conversation and say, well, can you tell me more about what you mean? What does empower this child? What are their passions and interests and skills and talents? And how can we like take it and invite it into our spaces? And like, let's use that. Let's let this child shine, right? Like, why are we giving her this like statement of like, just very definitive. Nope, she's not motivated, period. It's on her. There's like a flaw that she has that we just cannot, like, we're not here to fix children. They're not broken.
Yeah.
We got to rework that language.
Yeah. The motivation thing, here's the thing I always say. Have you seen this child outside of school?
Yeah.
Because I've seen the same quote unquote unmotivated kids on the basketball court, or doing a musical recital,
Yes.
or doing something. So I'm like, is it that they're not motivated because, or is there something else? Is there something they're trying to tell us? Because I don't think it's a personality thing. I think that this child just, maybe for some reason they have other interests that I see them shining in, so they should be able to perform. But how do we bring those outside experiences that we saw, that we observed? How do we bring that and help them relate to that in the content that we're presenting? I think that that's really important.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What about, so what are there some other things that we're saying that needs to change?
There's this phrase that I have heard more and more over the last 10 years, and it's the term long-term English learner. And it refers to a multilingual learner who has been in a program, a language learning program, for 5 or more years. And so again, it's not enough that they have a label already of being a multilingual learner, but now we're going to say, now you're long-term. So it's interesting when we make that designation on a student based on like current research. We know like deep level language learning, it's really more like 7 to 10 years of like study and practice and development and all of these things. And
but aren't we long-term English?
Yes, exactly.
I still struggle over stuff. Like I'm trying to figure
absolutely.
this out. That's why I'm like, it's throwing me off. You're like long-term, but I am as well. Like I have.
Exactly. I've been speaking English my entire life, and there's still so many words, phrases, registers that I don't know. There's tons of regionalisms I don't know. There's like content specific vocab. If you throw me in law school, I would be like, I don't know any of these things. I don't know what you're saying. And it's interesting too, because many of the same people who talk about like growth mindset and like lifelong learning and celebrating that, and then we call students a long-term, like, I don't think we call them to their face, but we have that designation and we say like, oh, now it's a long-term learner. But like, why is that a bad thing? Like, I mean, again, and that should be the norm. It really takes way longer than 5 years. So why are we like, oh, you woke up on your 5th year of being in this program on day 1 of your 5th year and you're still learning? Well, now you're a long-term language learner. Like, I don't know. It's just,
how are they measuring this? Like, is there I'm not as familiar. So how do you measure this? They need to. I'm curious.
So every year, and again, across the state. So I'm in Illinois. We are a WIDA state. So we take an access test, but some states are not WIDA states. They take a different language proficiency assessment. And so those are annual assessments that is like a federal requirement. So any student who's designated as a language learner has to take this assessment. And it tests the 4 domains of language. So reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Okay. So it gives a little capture. It gives a little like a level for each of those domains. And each state has their own exit criteria. So right now in Illinois, at like a 6-level scale, our current exit score is a 4.8 composite of all of those domains. So if you take the test over and over for 5 years or more and you don't reach that level of 4.8, then you get like that designation of being a long-term.
Oh, so they take the average of your 5 tests.
Yes.
Okay, and then if
so every year you get a new score, and if you don't reach that threshold, then now you are long-term. So it's interesting.
So from your perspective, what are some of the problems with this exam, and maybe if you were to make some suggestions, what would those be?
So I think it's so important that we have like, ways to measure language growth, but it is so different than how we measure content growth. And like language development is like this. It looks like this. It's not like a nice little pretty projection, or trajectory, because language doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's very dependent on situation and context and like level of comfort. So I always give the example, like if you asked me to stand up and talk for 30 minutes about multilingual education, whew, I could talk about it for days. But if you told me like, Carly, I want you to stand up and talk for 30 minutes about the Super Bowl game, and not the halftime show, not the commercials, but like the game.
Game.
I would stand up and be like, they use a football. It's shaped like this. It's brown and it has laces, and the players wear helmets, and they have touchdowns and people clap. And that's like about all I could share. But if you were to capture that as like as a language measure of my speaking ability, would you say like, oh, she's really limited in her ability to speak? Well, no, like, so it has to, it's very context based. And again, who I'm talking to, am I talking to a device? Am I talking to my friend? Am I speaking to the first lady? Like my affective filter might go up. I might be very nervous. So language is very special, and as it should be. That's how we communicate.
So the process to me sounds like it's not an accurate reflection of a child's ability to understand the English language.
And that measure is just it's a one-time snapshot, of a moment in time, right, for that particular child, for that particular school year. We want to give our students opportunities to speak with social language, academic language, heritage language, all of their language repertoire, right? And we want them to use that for a variety of purposes and audiences. So I think it's good to like have progress checks and like monitor language growth, but we can't monitor it in the same type of way.
Okay. Have you, I don't know if you've seen any research that supports like if I read reading comprehension test or something like that, and so let's say I'm learning English, and if I read something that's relatable to me, I can identify with. Is reading comprehension, has that been shown as a better measure? Like,
yeah, so we often talk.
What I'm asking?
we often talk about, like again, like background knowledge and like the difference between like activating background knowledge and building new background knowledge prior to a learning experience. But yes, it's very dependent on that. And many of our assessments, like I'm not talking about language assessments, specifically, but assessments in general, there's a whole lot of bias with what our students are taking tests on. And it's interesting, like, they'll like, oh, we'll give a baseball game example for this math problem. Not everyone plays baseball. Like it's the American pastime, right? But like we're from all over the world. Yeah. And yes, baseball is all over the world too, but it's not everywhere. And so there's a lot of like assumptions being made about our students and what they experience.
Okay.
And and that leads me to another phrase that I often overhear as we serve students. People have said like, oh, that student has no background knowledge. Like, again, like period, like not about like, oh, they don't have background knowledge or background experience with baseball, but like they just have no. What do you mean they have no background knowledge? They have tons. And so if we're looking again as students as like, oh, they're blank slates and we just have to fill these like empty vessels, like, no, our students are already full, complete human beings. And they have rich experiences. We have to like, again, like pause our language, pause our assumptions, unpack that a little bit. Like, ooh, I gotta, I need to reflect on this a little bit about my beliefs, about the kids I serve. And then say, like, let me get to know this student and their family a little bit more so that I can, really serve better.
Popsy says background knowledge is dependent on a cultural context. I agree. Yes. I agree. Yeah. It's the whole background knowledge thing. It's crazy how people will say stuff like that. And it's just like you said, it's like, not that this child doesn't have background knowledge. They just probably don't know what you're talking about, but they have their own knowledge, and ask them some questions or let them ask you some questions to see if you know all the stuff they know about. So exactly. It's one of those kind of situations. What about Okay, we talked about they're not motivated. Are there any other things that you want to add?
There's a few. I feel like sometimes we when we get around the table, and I'll always encourage folks, like when you start wanting to have these conversations with your teammates and with your colleagues, and in your schools and in your districts, I would say, like let's think of the idea of a language norm, setting a language norm for your space prior to getting involved in like the student data meeting. And sometimes people want to have this conversation at like an all staff meeting, and they'll want to say something like, oh, today we're going to introduce language norms. I would really encourage folks to pause and be really strategic about when they introduce this and how they introduce this. Because if you did this at a whole staff meeting and said like, today we're going to do this, people would tune out and they'd say like, oh, I don't talk like that, or I don't say those things, or I don't believe those things. So like, now I'm just going to check my email. I would say have the conversation with a smaller group of teachers. Like when you have a student data meeting, when you're thinking of one particular student and you bring in multiple perspectives around the table, and then you start to say like, okay, let's start having this, as we talk about like norms of collaboration today, we're going to start and end on time. Let's also say, let's introduce a few of these statements here, and print them out in advance. And I tell people, like, give it a sense of permanence. So I will create like a paper, and I'll write out the deficit laden statement, like she's not motivated, period.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll put like an alternate statement, like, how do we empower this child? Or like, what do we know about her passions, or something like that? And I would print them out and have like maybe 3, maybe 4 statements. And I'd say, friends around the table, like, we're going to start and end on time. Those are our norms for collaborating. These are the language norms we're going to stick to today. Because again, like when we get into those student data meetings, we often make 2 lists. We make one list of all the things that the student can't do yet. And then the other list is all the ways for one teacher on the team to like fix, and fix, right? Fill the holes, or whatever we want to call it, right? To fix the student. Like one teacher is going to do all these strategies or all these things. So instead, like, let's throw away the list and start with some language norms, and say to your teammates, like, I want us to hold ourselves accountable for these statements. And if I say it too, because again, like I'm a learner here. Like I'm still on this journey myself. I still am like becoming more and more aware of my own biases that I have. Because again, like I'm a white girl with blonde hair, and I'm serving students who come from all over the world who don't look like me. So again, it's so important for me, especially, to really become more aware. So I'd say to my teammates, like, hold me accountable too. I'm not like abdicating responsibility because I brought the papers. Like, hold me accountable too. And again, like, have the conversation, throw away the list of the things they can't do yet. And it creates like a good proactive meeting. And then at the end of the time, so whatever you go through and whatever you talk about, whatever plan you set up for that individual student, take time to have like a reflective conversation at the end. How did our language choices today help us better be more proactive, or better serve our students, or like, what are our noticings around that? And that's a really key piece, because many times, like at the end of a meeting, we're all like closing our laptops and running down the hall and trying to get to our next class, or pick up the kids from recess or whatever. So having that time for that reflective language conversation is really important.
How often do you think that should happen?
I would say anytime that you get around the table with other teachers about one student in mind, I would say do it every time. And again, maybe it's not 4 statements to unpack. Maybe it's just one. But like just having that as part of like the culture of the school. This is how we communicate. We find that it's important that we are mindful of our language choices, because they reflect our beliefs and mindsets about kids. So this is just a practice that we do. And again, it just kind of becomes ingrained. And I'll always say this too, my little sneaky tip for this. Like I'll say, like, print them out. Like I always printed them out on like Astro Brights paper. I love like neon colors. I'll always pick the neon pack, print them out, bring them to the meeting like ahead of time, have them all ready to go, and then accidentally on purpose leave them there in that space, especially if it's like a conference room where kids don't come in. But leave them there. And then the next team of teachers that comes in to talk about a new student, they'll start thinking like, what is that? Like, I have said that thing. I want to know a little bit more about that.
I like that. That's some good stuff. That's really, I think that's helpful as well. So thank you for sharing that.